Welcome. I hope everybody is well and staying healthy. And thanks very much for signing up for this webinar. We have a very large crowd. I mentioned that if you just signed on. And I suspect some of this is because we're in a new year and a new president as of yesterday and a new Congress. And we're all wondering where things go here in the world of retirement planning. So today's discussion will help. It's a timely and detailed look at an important retirement planning issue. We're going to do a deep dive on retirement drawdown strategies. And so I have these two fantastic guests here to help us cover this important topic. Joe Elsasser is a name that I think might be known to many of you. As founder and CEO of Covisum, his firm offers financial planning software to help advisors grow. But more than that, he's a recognized expert in the retirement planning field and always great for new insights and ideas. Our other guest is James DiLellio. Jim is an associate professor of decision sciences at Pepperdine Business School. And it's worth mentioning that he has won an award from the American College for a paper he wrote on today's very subject. So, gentlemen, welcome. Okay, let's introduce the session. The session looks beyond the question of what should I withdraw each year at retirement and really delves into the science of optimizing drawdowns from retirement capital. We'll start by considering some recent and contemplated changes in regulations and law, and then we'll delve into how some of that may affect these strategies. Now, one more thing before we get started. If you find today's webinar useful, please write down Wednesday, well, I forgot if it's Wednesday anyway, March 9th, at 2 p.m. Eastern. Our new professor of practice is a name I'm going to guess is probably known to all of you, and that's Ed Slott. Ed and I will have a discussion on IRA planning. It'll be great to have Ed on board with the American College. So again, that is March 9th at 2 p.m. And so it will follow a lot of what we're talking about today. Okay, let's get started by recognizing that the recent changes we've had that have directly impact retirement drawdown strategies before we ask our gentlemen how they see it all happening. Now, we obviously know that the Secure Act and CARES Act has had an impact on drawdowns, and we'll discuss this with Joe and Jim. But I also want to point out the recent changes to life expectancy tables, because I'm not sure everybody caught on to that. So, let's talk about what's going on there. They changed, the IRS came out with new regulations with new life expectancies. Okay, the change was made on November 12th of last year, final regulations. And what it does is it extends life expectancies by approximately 2 years. And that begins effective 2022. And when I say extends life expectancies, think about it. That means that if you're going to live 2 years longer, as an example, then you don't need to take out as much because you're spreading it out over a longer life expectancy. Well, the effect of that is we're going to continue with existing RMDs in 2021. I think it's very important you note that because not everybody's caught on to that. If you calculate using the 2022 numbers, you could come up with too low of an RMD, and many of you know that what happens there is 50% penalty. So it also means lower RMDs thereafter, and that means you're going to have more balance remaining in your IRAs and your 401ks. So I want to point out that's an issue that we're going to talk about as we think about it. Take the example. I just made an example of somebody who's 70 and a half years old. In last year, in 2020. And let's look at, they have $1 million and they are forced to take their RMDs. Well, if we hadn't had the Secure Act and the Secure Act, the CARES Act, and these new actuarial tables, this is what would have happened. At 70 and a half, they would have started drawing down according to the RMD table, and their million after 10 years would be 642,000 and change, okay? But what we have is the CARES Act waived RMDs last year, and the Secures Act said that RMDs don't have to start till age 72, so the person doesn't even start till 72. And then I use these new actuarial tables, these new life expectancies. So instead of having a balance after 10 years of 642,000, that individual is going to have a balance of 711,000. The question is, just because you can extend out your RMDs, do you want to? Maybe you want to take them earlier. And that's some of the things we're going to be talking about. Let's talk about one other thing before we get going on the kind of the discussion and questions about this. And that is the TCDTRA. That's always a tough one. That's the Taxpayer, I have to look at it to see it, Taxpayer Certainty and Disaster Tax Relief Act. Now, that's the one that was part of the omnibus bill where we got the stimulus checks and all that. And there's nothing in the law that directly affects drawdown strategies. But there are two items worth mentioning. That's why I wanted to bring it up. First of all, there were modifications to 7702 of the Internal Revenue Code, which make it easier for life insurance companies to offer cash value life insurance in this very low interest rate environment, particularly whole life. This is worth noting because there has been a lot of talk lately about taking withdrawals from IRAs, even before the RMD period, and using those to pay for life insurance. Idea is the life insurance will work as an alternative to the stretch IRA that essentially we lost in the Secure Act. And the other thing about the end of year tax laws, what it didn't say, it did not suspend RMDs for another year. So RMDs are back on the table. So one last thing to think about is what's on the horizon with new administration in Congress. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about this because it's not law, but I think we need to acknowledge that there is the Secure Act 2.0 that's been offered again by Congressman O'Neill from the head of the Ways and Means Committee, and this is bipartisan. So this is very possible that this law will come through in 2021. It offers more employer credits for 401ks for new establishment of new 401ks. So we may see more activity along those lines. It at least is planning to extend RMDs to age 75, and they want to add a age 60 catch-up of about $10,000 so that people can put more in their plans. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but it's certainly not just a crazy bill that's not going to happen. It has bipartisan support, and it's in Ways and Means. The other is we have a new president as of yesterday, and we have this new Congress. What's going to happen there? I think many of you are aware there's proposals of moving the top marginal income tax bracket, for example, from 37 to 39.5. There's talk about bringing the very high exemption for estate and gift tax down to somewhere around maybe 5 million or even 3.5 million, who knows? And there's talk about shoring up the Social Security system, which we know is having its issues. And that has the interesting, that's why the graphic here, the donut, is the donut provision that has been talked about, where essentially you'd still have the 6.2 coming up to the wage base of whatever it is, about $140,000 of income this year. And then what would happen is at $400,000, when you hit that top marginal tax bracket, the 6.2 would kick in again. Will it happen? I don't know, but I thought it was worth at least mentioning and acknowledging these are some of the things going on. So with that as an introduction, and I hope we have everybody online now, I want to start with Joe. And, first of all, Joe, we have a nice combination here. We have an academic and we have a practitioner. So how did the two of you get to know each other before we get into the details of this?
Frankly, I read one of his papers and reached out, and then we were lucky enough to connect at an industry conference.
Okay, well, it's good that you have brought him into the whole conversation. And Jim, I'll let you defend yourself here shortly. But Joe, let me get a sense of the mood out there. I mean, with your background as an advisor and now working with advisors, what's the retirement planning world look like right now? Are people moving forward? Are they holding off, or are they just plain befuddled?
Sure. I'm sure a lot of advisors on the line are in the same spot we were. 2020 was a white knuckle year. You know what I mean? It's grab on, hang on, and let's see where this thing goes. In our practice, we were really busy doing a lot of Roth conversions and frankly, holding people's hands with the plans that they had committed to in past years. So that was 2020. What we saw coming into the end of 2020 was a feeling of, okay, you know what, this thing is fine. It is going to stabilize. And so while people may have been holding off on making these, I'm going to call them larger strategic decisions, like which account will I be drawing from? I mean, heck, we had people who were on the cusp of retirement said, maybe I'll wait another 6 months. I just want to make sure that I'm not retiring into the worst market in a long time. So we saw towards the end of last year and coming into this year, definitely a lot of thawing, a lot of people getting ready to go ahead and make those big decisions, go ahead and put plans in place for withdrawal strategies throughout retirement.
Interesting how that's happening. This will be an interesting year as we go forward. And so let me bring it over to you, Jim. So a key issue in retirement planning is obviously determining an optimal strategy for traditional IRAs, 401ks, Roth, that kind of thing. In other words, consumption during retirement. This shouldn't be a back of the napkin calculation, and it shouldn't be a rule of thumb. I think we can agree on this. And it's great that you've dug into this really as a science and have created an amazing way to tackle this issue. So can you tell us what you've been studying and what you've found in general?
Sure. Thank you for that introduction, Steve. And I do appreciate the opportunity to speak to everyone here today. So, I have had the unique opportunity. I did actually come from industry, actually not from the financial planning industry, but actually from the defense industry. So I can certainly appreciate the fact that now as an academic, I can actually spend and dwell time on topics that are very, very relevant. So one of the topics I talk a little bit about is the Secure Act. So as Steve had mentioned earlier on, the Secure Act did have implications to the effects of inherited IRAs, and specifically the ability for the heirs to take that IRA and stretch out its withdrawals over time. I had done some previous work where we actually looked at, well, what was the benefit of that? What was the opportunity stretching out that inherited IRA was having on a beneficiary? Because potentially if the beneficiary was quite young, they have a long lifespan ahead of them. There could be a significantly large amount of value there. Our previous studies showed that you get about a third more of value by being able to stretch it out. Now, with the Secure Act, of course, that rule has changed. Now it has to be drawn down over a 10-year span. To me, it begged the question, well, how much of a reduction of benefit is that? I heard a lot of qualitative discussions between accountants, between financial planners on what this effect might be. So I actually tagged one of my colleagues who's now an emeritus professor of accounting from Pepperdine, Mike Kinsman, and I wrote an article called The Secure Act and Your Retirement Objectives. And what we looked at in this study was, well, what if now you don't draw down over a lifespan, you have only this 10-year span? We developed a model around it with a set of assumptions. And he said, okay, what do you end up with? And what we found was about a 14% additional value above and beyond what you would have gotten if you would have just had the heir just cash everything out. That the opportunity to go ahead and invest this money, keep it invested in the IRA or potentially even in the Roth IRA, had still some benefit, not as much of a benefit as it was before, but still a significant benefit. Just as important, or maybe even more important, that was our model's results based upon a single set of assumptions. We did create what we call a tornado chart in decision sciences. That's what you see here on the screen under figure 1. We said, well, what happens if you start varying things? Because not every individual is going to fall under the exact category of assumptions that we developed. And so what we found very quickly is that, you can start varying assumptions like, what is the capital gain rate of the heir? What return on stocks do you have? What's your asset allocation? And what we found is, you're going to have some variation, but it's never going to go much above about 17%, and it's not going to go much below about 10%. So unfortunately, it is a little bit of a reduction in terms of the benefit of the inherited IRA relative to what was available before, but there is still a benefit. So there is sort of a positive side to it. So that's the one area I've worked in. If you can go ahead and flip to the next slide, Steve.
Sure.
I'll just talk a little bit about another thread of research. And in fact, I got to thank American College again for actually providing the award that was actually some of this work in its earlier stages. So what we discovered in that earlier work was trying to find a global optimal retirement decision is actually very challenging. In fact, what our research has most recently showed is that you can actually break up not just the groupings of retirees, but from a mathematical or optimization perspective, there's actually three categories. The first category being you have a retiree that, given their retirement income needs, which is the vertical bracket times their retirement horizon, kind of their total amount of income they're going to want to have in retirement, and the horizontal axis is what is their net worth plus any kind of present value of annuities. They're going to fall into one of these categories. So the top left is the retiree, given these assumptions, just wouldn't have sufficient funds to support their expected retirement income needs. What we found was if you just take the common rule and apply some of the rules that we developed in some of our previous work, which really just says go up as high in a tax bracket as you can relative to the heir, you can see anywhere between a 30 and 40 basis points tax alpha. And what I mean by a tax alpha is instead of using the common rule, which simply sequences from your taxable account to your IRA to your Roth IRA, doesn't go to one until one is completely exhausted. By modifying it and willing to take on additional funds, you can get this additional tax alpha. Kind of the same thing on the other end, which is you got sort of excessive amounts of money. We developed what we call a modified common rule that also gets you some tax alpha. The sweet spot, though, is where we found the most intriguing. Here we developed what's called a sequential least squares programming approach. It's one of many general purpose optimization routines out there. And the problem this routine has is it looks for a maximum, but sometimes it doesn't know if it found a global maximum. And that's why the title of this work is Seeking a Global Optimal Retirement Decision. So imagine if you were, say, hiking to the top of the mountain is your optimal decision. Unfortunately, the algorithms and the numerics that go into this routine don't know there might be a very tall hill nearby, which makes, unfortunately, it very, very challenging. It's only within this sweet spot in the middle that it seems to perform the best. And as you can see, it actually performs significantly well. In fact, anywhere between 70 and 80 basis points of additional return simply because you are drawing down things in a slightly different sequence. That was also based upon this assumption or this insight that we developed from this previous work that showed that there are multiple optimal solutions, that you can actually stay within a tax bracket over a couple of years and you'll still end up with the same result. And that actually makes the mathematical problem that much more challenging. And so by breaking it into these three categories, we discovered very quickly we can actually not only address pragmatically how retirees and planners are looking at this, but also just from a mathematical perspective. So I just have one more chart that I'd like to show, which is the next one. Steve, if you can go ahead and flip to that one.
I think we got her. There we go.
So here, this gives you just a quick snapshot of what does it look like if you made some assumptions about the retiree. What you see on the left-hand side is the common rule withdrawal sequence. So what's in orange there is going to be drawing down from your taxable account. What's in blue is from your tax-deferred account. And then if you see any green, that's your Roth account. What's along the bottom there follows this geometric paradigm that we established previously, which says keep all of the fixed income, whether it's pension, whether it's some kind of annuity, whether it's Social Security, that's going to be there regardless. That's that lower level. And then how do you stack on top of that to reach some desired income level? And what you can see is that we have the retiree and his spouse living for 15 years. After that 15th year, the one spouse passes away. Now you have a surviving spouse. The tax brackets drop down. And as a consequence, there's quite a bit of taxes paid in those later years. By knowing this information, you can actually develop a more optimal sequence, which is what you see on the right. So no longer are you forcing required minimum distributions, which are what you're seeing in that little yellow bar in the blue. You're no longer seeing that. In fact, the overall inheritance in this case was actually increased by about a third, which again, in this particular case, gave us a tax alpha of about 72 basis points. I actually do this as an academic. In fact, part of the award that I received from the American College, I actually put forward to actually building this as an online calculator. I had enough academics and those in practice curious to be able to play around with it. It's free, it's online, the web link is there. So I encourage you to go ahead and take a look at it. If you're feeling more ambitious like Joe did and wants to actually pick up one of my papers, I'm always more than happy to share those. If you're maybe a little bit more, you want to be a little more casual about it, I do give some information about the calculator along with that second web page as well. So I hope you all found that of interest. I could tell you From an academic's perspective, this is a fascinating problem to look at, not just because of some of the technical rigor, but by just the sheer importance of it in the financial planning area. So thank you so much, Steve. I appreciate the time.
Yeah, well, we're not done with you yet. So and I want to let the audience know, of course, there's going to be a test on all of this at the top of the hour. And I have a follow-up question I'll ask you on this as we get later on. But let's go over to Joe for a minute, because we obviously know that these withdrawal strategies are complex and important decisions. And I looked at Jim's paper, and it's fascinating. So we need the help of software, and we need every tool we can. And fintech's really been changing at breakneck speed. So can you give us a sense of what software solutions are out there for crunching some of these withdrawal opportunities, by the way, including your own?
Sure. So many of the softwares that are out there today evolved out of necessity. You know what I mean? Clients retire and they've got money in their house, they've got money in their brokerage account, they've got money in CDs, they've got money in mutual funds, they've got money in IRAs, 401ks, they've heard about Roths but don't know about conversions, yada, yada, yada. And they just want to know, which one should I use in which order? And so I think the evolution of fintech has really just been a lot of advisors who are just looking for better answers to client questions. That's how ours, frankly, came about. So Jim took this really cool global approach, and that was what fascinated me so much with what he was doing in his research. And the way we approached it was really kind of the practical, call it boots on the ground approach. And that is, every year we do these things. So I think there's a slide that kind of shows a tax map. And this is just a screenshot from one of our softwares. But the big challenge that I was running into was these interactions between different income types. We can all look at the client's tax bracket and say, okay, they should pay X on the next withdrawal. But I guarantee that any one of us in the audience who's been doing this any amount of time has been surprised. And so for me, the problem is those surprises. And so really where we started was by saying, okay, when you put it all together, I really have two levers that I can pull on. I can pull on capital gains, or I can pull on ordinary income. And so if we hold everything else constant and we just move the ordinary income, that's what's happening as you move right along the bottom on this chart. And this is a client that has Social Security. They have a non-qualified account that is spinning off some capital gains, some long-term capital gains, and they have IRA withdrawals. And what we see is some surprising impacts. That spike there in the middle, where the client pays about 49.95% as an effective marginal rate. In other words, how much do they actually lose to federal income tax on that portion of the withdrawal? It's only about $7,000 of withdrawal. But if I have a choice of sitting right on the left-hand edge of that and not experiencing that 49.95, or accidentally falling over to the right-hand side, I save the client a lot of money by virtue of being aware of it. And so for us, we were using this tool each year to identify, when we're talking to clients, to identify soft spots, places where, hey, we can actually get some money out of this IRA that is eventually going to become a problem when we hit required minimum distributions at a rate that is lower than we might pay later on in life. And as a result, we can kind of smooth those brackets. Ultimately, that's what was appealing about Jim's research was, okay, here's a systematic, programmatic way of doing that, where we were kind of manually doing it year after year after year in kind of an iterative way. So you might ask, how does that happen? If you've never encountered that 49.95, I think we have the next slide that just says you've got $1,000 IRA withdrawal that falls in a 12% bracket, so you'd expect $120 of tax. But what actually happens is it drags $850 of capital or of taxable of Social Security out of into taxable range, which also gets taxed at a 12% rate, which in turn goes back and grabs $1,850 of capital gains that would have been zero and pushes them into the 15, ultimately resulting in this, $500 tax bill on a $1,000 withdrawal. So for us, the question was, if we can build processes to dodge those spots or identify the soft spots, then those are the places where we might do Roth conversions, or we might harvest a little extra this year instead of next year. Or maybe we'd take a loan for an unforeseen expense for someone who never would feel like they needed to take a loan because they had so much other money. But hey, paying a few months worth of interest makes a lot more sense than paying tax on a spike. So those are some of the concepts that drove our work. And ultimately it comes together into something that is similar to Jim's research. It is pretty significantly different in that we're going year by year and not necessarily looking for a global max. What we're trying to do is follow a pattern, kind of the same practitioner's pattern year by year. So if you want to pop over to the next slide, this is kind of a conceptual way of doing that. You see a similar chart at the top. And for us, each of these strategies or retirement income patterns starts with a Social Security strategy and then builds other retirement income around it. So you can kind of see that sequential nature. In the top left, you've got both Social Securities early and then filling in with non-qualified money before using IRA money. You see the minimum distributions along the way. And if there's Roth money, you use that last. That's what we considered the base case. And then on the right, you've got a Social Security strategy, and you're still using non-qualified money, but you're doing Roth conversions along the way until you hit an effective marginal rate that is equal to or greater than their average tax rate over their lifetime. That's one possible pattern that you might follow, from our perspective and from some of the other retirement income tools out there. And so, interestingly enough, clients, while they want to know where the money's going to come from, they love knowing the bottom line. And so when we look down at the bottom, you just regularly, with the common withdrawal pattern, you regularly see this place where for the first 4 or 5 years of retirement, clients are thrilled because they're paying zero federal income tax. They're even bragging to their friends, but they don't realize how inefficient that is over the long term and how likely they are to get kicked later when they start to have those required minimum distributions, pushing them into higher tax brackets. So you notice on the left, there's no red. There's no tax in the early years. On the right, there's a little bit of tax in that first year because that's actually the first year of a significant Roth conversion, mainly because there's no Social Security in that year after doing that Social Security optimization. So that's one example of how these all come together in software tools is really looking to identify the soft spots year by year and then following a pattern throughout the course of the client's retirement and projecting out what the impact might be. So in this case, the estate value column at the very top just shows that and this is the present value of the eventual estate net of tax. So, it's about, in this case, it's about a 10 to 15% increase in the estate value by virtue of following a harvesting pattern or a strategy versus following a common pattern.
Well, and Joe, I've been monitoring the chat section for questions, and one of the themes I'm getting here with some people is, well, what do you mean by effective marginal tax bracket, or how could it be 49%? My answer would be that's why you need the software, and my plug for RICP, because it's not like you could look up in the Internal Revenue Code and find a 49% marginal tax rate, but the effect of it is that it is a 49%.
If we sit in the client's chair and we say, what matters to me? They're going to say, when I do this, how much more tax do I pay? That is the definition of the effective marginal rate. It's what do I actually lose to federal income tax on this next action?
Exactly. Yeah. So let me ask you this one, and I guess I'll start with you, Joe. Professor Sophia Duffy and I at the American College just published a paper on an interesting topic, whether a robo-advisor can actually be a fiduciary. And especially when you look at the sophistication of Jim's modeling that he went through and the flexibility of the retirement software you were just showing us, I guess it begs the question of how the DNA-based advisor fits into the equation. So I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on how does the advisor leverage these models and this kind of software to help the client come up with the right solution.
So my kids are 10 and 12. Last night we were sitting at dinner and we were talking about garbage in, garbage out, and they had never heard that. Oh. It's just not part of their vocabulary. And so I got to explain garbage in, garbage out. And to me, that is going to be the forever struggle of the robo-advisor, is for a consumer who does not do this every day. They're going to go through retirement one time. They're not going to know which facts are salient, and they're not going to know the why behind the question that's being asked. When I sit across the table from a client, I can look in their eyes and I can see confusion sometimes when confusion exists. I'm not saying I'll see it every time. And frankly, at some point in the future, AI is going to see that too. But for now, we have the ability to clarify the inputs and clarify the results of software tools in a way that I don't think any robo as it exists today has the capability to do.
Yeah. Jim, any thoughts on that, coming from the academic standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, so I certainly would echo everything Joe said. Garbage in is garbage out. And then there's what's going on in the inside. So, when you develop any of these models, every mathematical model of any phenomenon, in this case tax, it has to take certain assumptions into account. Sometimes those assumptions are very relevant to the user of the software, and sometimes they're just not, or they're just a little too far disconnected. Now, you can't have the perfect model. That's what we call life, right? Life is our perfect model. We'll see what happens in the next year with these tax laws if and when they get passed. But, the complexity of the model gets to the point where I agree with Joe. A lot of individuals, they'll just be confused, and they need some guidance on how they can best make sense of it. There may be some that are ambitious, that are willing to pick up things and learn a little bit from it, but others, they just need to know, how can I make a better decision in my retirement based upon the insights the software can provide.
Okay, well, let's move on, and we will be leaving time for questions. I'm monitoring as we go along, but we will leave about 10 minutes, and we're in good shape. But we've primarily focused on 401k, IRA, Roth, and taxable accounts as far as income, but I want to pursue how we factor in some related retirement issues, one for the middle market and one for the high net worth market. So let's start on the middle market one of Social Security. And this is for Joe. Social Security obviously is on the ropes in terms of funding, and we've had several sessions with the American College on this. But thinking from your standpoint, your software and working with advisors, how do you factor this challenge to Social Security as a very important income stream in planning? Do you give it a haircut? What do you do?
Sure. When we think about planning in general, we've got a terrain ahead of us that we expect, but that terrain can change. And of course, we've got a new administration, and it means that terrain probably isn't even going to change necessarily evenly across different segments of clients. For example, my typical clients are middle income, lower affluent clients. We don't work with high net worth people. When we get a doctor with 2 buildings that's looking to retire, we refer them away. I know that most people on that call probably laugh at me for that, but it's not our market. It's not what we do. When we think about Social Security, we need to plan for the idea that Congress will be aware that people who retired last year, this year, 5 years ago, retired with a certain level of Social Security income in mind. So historically, when they've made changes, they've done everything they could to not impact people who are already collecting benefits. So I think we start with this base assumption that we will not get to 2029 to 2034, the point where benefits just automatically drop by 24 to 30%. I think we start with that assumption, but we need to stress test the plan and say, well, what happens to the plan if that kind of cut does happen? Is the plan still okay? Is the client still able to reach their goals? And if they're not, what are our contingency plans? Do we have other assets we can tap? Do we have specific parts of the lifestyle that we know we're going to cut if that future looks more likely? And we're going to know more each and every year.
Well, I think that's helpful. So that's kind of for the middle market. Let's take it over to the high net worth market. And I'm putting up a slide, hopefully here, that I use in some classes, talking about working with the high net worth or the wealthy people. And what I'm getting at here is, in this example that you see, the individual has over about $23 million in a combination of a business and an IRAs and real estate. And I'd submit, just as a tax lawyer, that for her retirement drawdowns, we're going to go a different way. She'd first tap her tax deductible business income items like deferred comp because she still owes the business. She'd start eating up her IRAs next. Yeah, they're taxable, but every dollar tax at 37% is better than, or gives her an opportunity to make a gift to her heirs that avoids a 40% gift tax. And further, to the extent she has something left in her estate, which she probably will, she'll want to have her appreciated capital assets like her business and her real estate, because that way, at least for now, she'll have a step up in basis. So with the wealthy, we're often advising these clients to take taxable IRAs first as retirement streams. So where I'm going with this, Jim, is you talked about those 3 different tiers earlier when you were showing that slide. The idea that I'm talking about is burning up as many assets, taxable assets, as a gift to the individual. How do you build that into your 3-tiered model that you are working with?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So, like I mentioned before, all models have their assumptions. We built in 2 assumptions that are very relevant to that question. The first is the model that I showed you there did not assume estate taxes. So I'm assuming that whatever assets the individual might have, we're not triggering any kind of estate taxes. I'm also kind of going on the other end, which I think Joe actually highlighted really nicely, which is what I'll just call wonky things happen with Social Security when you get to those lower levels. We've also sort of assumed that away, which we said, you know what, we're going to say that your income's at a level where 85% of your Social Security is going to be taxed as ordinary income, and then the other 15% you can go ahead and get tax-free. So I guess that's the first way we look at it. We've sort of necked the problem into that space. Then after that, a lot of it comes down to where are the advantages of, say, a step up in cost basis of a taxable account that could occur versus, using some of the Roth money in certain years to not pay quite as much in tax. And it's quite the dynamic problem. As you saw in those results, there are basically years where you're using a little bit of everything. And in fact, it's that little bit of everything that allows you to get that a little bit of additional gain. So I guess that's probably my best answer to the question, Steve, which is, you have to kind of mix things in. You should certainly not be sequencing like pretty much every large brokerage, and I'm thinking about places like Fidelity, Vanguard, Schwab, generally recommend just sequence through your assets using the common rule. Start with all your taxable assets. Once those are completely extinguished, then go on to your IRA. Of course, step 0 is make sure if you have RMDs, take those, and then go on to your Roth. Do not use that sequencing because it's pretty much guaranteed to be suboptimal.
Yeah. And I would add one other thing to that as we go into one last question before we get into the Q&A session is this is the reason that Robo's not going to solve everything. It feels to me like when you get people up in the high net worth market, you start kind of transitioning, but you don't, some of your estate planning may make the estate tax go away. So you can go back to some regular withdrawal strategies. But really, I don't think AI has gotten to the point that it can pick that off. I think that takes human intelligence, not just human intelligence, but coordination among advisors. So let me just kind of ask a final question before we do Q&A. We got a new year and we got a lot of change happening. Hopefully we're coming out of the pandemic, a new administration, new Congress, and the economy's wherever the economy is, a lot to deal with. How are each of you planning to look at retirement planning issues in 2021? What's your new topics of interest, something you're looking at, major changes, things you're thinking about? Why don't we start with you, Jim?
Yeah, so, one of the areas that has actually not gotten much research by academics in this space is the future uncertainty of tax rates. Mm-hmm. So yes, we will most likely have brackets, but those rates, I've looked at a number of academic papers that have actually documented and looked back at what have the rates been over the last 100 years. And depending what bracket you're in, they're kind of all over the place. And we had some years of very, very high taxes and some years of very low. So the thread of research that I'm tugging on right now is what does that mean when you start having that much potential uncertainty in your future tax rates? We know that the current set of tax rates expires in, I believe, I'm not going to say the year because I'll probably get it wrong, but it's not very far out. So those will expire, which means there will be some new taxes. Having spoken with other academics as well as those in practice, this is an area that I think the academic space can really help serve the community, which is, what does that mean in terms of the sequencing? If the tax rates go up a lot, does that mean we should suddenly be maybe biasing more towards Roth accounts and less towards taxable accounts? I honestly don't know until I build up a little bit more of the modeling capacity to be able to do that. And that's actually that's my current project, and to me the most exciting, because that's something that has a very good likelihood of happening just by the very nature of, our taxes are governed by legislation, and legislation is going to change in the future.
Yeah. Joe, same question. What are you looking at this year?
Of course, tax. But for us, Social Security is, I think we're just going to hear more and more from consumers about Social Security with questions about it. We just keep inching closer and closer to this deadline. If you rewind to 1983, we got all the way up to the deadline before we got significant reform. But you had there was a lot of chatter along the way. And I think the uncertainty that will be growing among consumers will be something that people will want advice on. So, I've recently put out a couple articles on that. And we've been spending some time in our software on working around that. So I know we'll be focusing there, and also, frankly, around portfolio risk, because this has been a fun project that I've gotten to spend a little bit of time with Jim on recently. When you see a March that's a 30% dip on the S&P 500, it makes you think, gosh, what could that have been? What other things can we be doing in that space, really coordinating this idea of portfolio risk with retirement income planning?
Good. Well, as we go into that, I'm going to make one comment myself as far as something I'm kind of curious about. Is if they actually move up, well, they've already moved up RMDs to 72, and if the Secure Act 2.0 makes it 75, then it somewhat makes RMDs a little more, not moot, but at least a lesser issue. And so I just did an article in Forbes where I was saying, I can give you at least 3 reasons why you should be taking your required, they aren't required, but start taking distributions now rather than later. So I think 2021 will be a year when our shifting and our brain goes, oh, don't always just look at the RMD. Now start taking out money to maybe buy life insurance as a bequest instead of the stretch IRA, or to use in a charitable remainder trust, or those kind of things. I think this will be an interesting year for that. And by the way, you see I have up here RICP as I go through these questions. This is where you're going to get a lot of answers to things we're talking about. A lot of what Joe was talking about, an effective marginal tax break, we cover in that. So I encourage you to do that. So as we go into that, one question that we had pre-submitted by somebody who was signing on. So I'll go ahead and ask, I think Joe, I suppose first, so either one of you can answer it. But given the current economic climate, if you are planning to retire in the next 3 to 5 years, how much of your nest egg would you be comfortable keeping invested? How would what would you say to a client who wants to cash out their secure principal? It's a good question.
I think it is a good question. It's a regular question. So for me, in the practical aspect, I've got to get to the why. I've got to understand whether this is a fear decision or whether it's gosh, I have plenty of money and I don't have to take any risk to reach my goals. Those are 2 very different motivations for making a statement like that. Mm-hmm. And depending on the motivation, if the client really does need to take some risk to have a high probability of success of getting through retirement, then I want to educate them on that. And on the other hand, if they don't need to take risk, and there are a variety of ways to get reasonable rates of return without exposing principal. And more of those products have been introduced over the years. So I know the RICP program covers a variety of those. So to me, it's getting to the why and then identifying a solution that's going to get them to reaching their goals while letting their stomach rest easy at night.
Right. And Jim, anything to add on that? I thought that's a good way of looking at it.
Well, no, I think Joe nailed it, which is, I would have started with probably a less eloquent answer, which is it depends. It depends on what your income needs are. It depends on, if you already have millions of dollars and you're not looking to draw down that much in retirement, then why take on additional risk? But then there's the behavioral piece, which I think is an area that I haven't gotten into, but is so critical, and making sure you address that behavioral piece. So I'm not going to say any more because Joe said it way better than I could ever articulate it, but I would certainly say, it really depends upon the situation.
Okay. One question we had come in, I just very quickly can address. I mentioned step up in basis. That has been proposed by candidate Biden, not necessarily President Biden. And people sometimes misunderstand what a lot of them have talked about is once you have a net worth of X. And so it might be over $1 million, is that type of thing. I just will use the benefit of age to say this is not the first time in that rodeo. Of course, in 2010, we had the oddball one year where we had a carryover of basis if you chose it, but also during the Carter years. Yes, that's in your history books. They actually did effectively have a carryover of basis, and the financial community finally convinced them that's not going to work. Having said that, Canada does have it. So what's being proposed, it's not even a proposal at this time, what's being discussed is having a carryover of basis, which would radically change how we would look at retirement distributions for high net worth. So that's why I reference it, and Jim mentioned it a little bit too. Let's see, I had a question that maybe you can clarify for me. He was asking about conversions to Roth, and this clients often only can convert to Roths from qualified plans, and therefore they can't pay for the tax out of their own pocket. Joe, have you run into that question? Why? I guess I don't understand why you couldn't convert to the Roth and then pay for it in cash, which, by the way, we all know is better because that way you get more in the Roth. Sure.
So I think it's a really good question. So here might be the example. The client doesn't have any non-qualified money. The only savings they have is Social Security and IRA money. And if that's the case, if the only savings they have are Social Security and IRA money, then we have to withdraw extra IRA money to pay the tax on the conversion.
Right.
And sometimes that can make sense because sometimes the amount of income they need doesn't carry them all the way to the top of the, for example, 12% bracket. And so sometimes it might make sense to go ahead and withdraw a little extra and ultimately use that IRA, an additional withdrawal from the IRA, to pay the tax. Really all depends on the time horizon for the Roth and the returns, relative rates of returns, et cetera. But
that's a good point. I hadn't thought of it from that way. Here's a really good one that we really haven't addressed, and it's certainly a consideration in the coming years, inflation. I mean, obviously we're sitting in this multi-trillion-dollar situation, taxes might go up. I guess, Jim, have you yet looked at how some of these drawdown strategies, how elastic, how much they'd be affected by a big increase in inflation?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one of the sensitivities I'm actually looking at as part of also looking at tax sensitivity in the future, recognizing that inflation doesn't need to wait for Congress to pass it. It'll happen whenever it likes to happen. So, yeah, I mean, the way we did the modeling in what I shared with you really was looking, if you notice, those tax brackets were all flat over time because tax brackets are basically adjusted for inflation each year. And so if you make them flat each year, you're basically stripping out the effect of inflation, which means whatever additional return you're really getting the real return on those investments. So by increasing the inflation, that would have the indirect effect on the modeling that I've done on basically creating a drag on those returns, which means your funds aren't going to last quite as long. You may not have as much to give to an heir. But in terms of the specific effect on sequencing, it's a great question, and that's one that I'm hoping I'll have answered here, certainly in this calendar year. In fact, I'm working on a paper that will hopefully get some of that information out here within within probably about the next month or so. But I will warn those of you in practice, the academic review cycle is slow by its very nature. For it to actually come into print is going to take some time. But since I do have a blog now, one of the things I like to blog about is things like this before I have a chance for them to go through the full vetting process within an academic journal, if it's relevant to individuals in practice. Or sometimes I just even have friends or family ask me these questions and say, could you not give me the full paper, just give me a little bit of a snippet? I say, that's why I created the blog. So, but yeah, that's my sense of it. Inflation will just kind of erode away on those real returns.
And the blog's on ETF Math Guy, right? These are really digestible.
Right.
Well,
I try to.
Yeah, we'll try to get some of the information out on our website about where you can access things. Because Joe, the other question that's come up is, gee, they liked your software. What's the digestible version of how they could find out more?
Sure. You want it now? It's covisum.com, but I think there's a slide.
Okay, so I'll make one other comment on the inflation thing. Now, there's a difference, obviously, between inflation and a hot stock market, but either way, where you see rates going up, one of the things that, for those of you that are new or advisors, is consumers will tend to emphasize different things depending on what's going on. So when you have a hot stock market or inflation, taxes don't become as big an issue, and they start asking, what's the best thing to invest in, less than how can I pay less tax. So part of our job, I suppose, is to give a holistic answer and say those are all important, not just that. One of the questions was polling, when you're starting to take your RMDs, should it be from short-term things, cash accounts and short-term bonds and that kind of thing? And I'm not sure if there's any question there beyond just obviously you don't want to take your assets that are in market and eat those up for RMDs. But again, Joe, you kind of run into these questions that the consumer will ask. Is there more to that question than I'm missing?
Well, I mean, in my world, there's always a little bit of cash reserve, which some might argue just represents drag on the portfolio. Others might suggest that if you're frequently rebalancing, annually rebalancing, I think Kitsy's even had a paper on this, then really it doesn't matter where you're withdrawing from, because if you take that systematic withdrawal and then rebalance within the year, then ultimately you're back to the same allocation. And if stock's lost, then your rebalance is going to rebuy them low. So it's not as significant as some of the arguments might have made it to be. But from the behavioral perspective, clients hate thinking of the idea that they're selling at the bottom. That they're selling out of volatile assets when they're down. And that's where a cash reserve is at minimum a behavioral buffer, if it's not a more effective retirement income strategy.
One last question, and then we need to wrap up. But Joe, just because it's come up a couple times, and it kind of gets to that whole effective marginal tax thing. So I want some people to walk away kind of understanding the tax torpedo. We teach this in our ICP, but one of the people said on the spike on the tax chart that you had, why does the tax rate go down to the right of the tax spike? So it's worth reinforcing what's going on there.
Sure. And the reason it drops back down is because at some point, a full 85% of your Social Security benefit has become taxable. And at some point, all of your capital gains have been pushed into the 15% bracket. And this is true in the middle income space. You have a similar situation where maybe you have net investment income tax, or let's just say that I had incorporated Medicare premiums into that chart. I would see this spike because Medicare premiums are a cliff. If I go $1 over that threshold, I'm actually going to lose a lot more than $1 because of that $1 I went over. So it's well over 100% on a small slice of income. And so, that's why you see that is at some point that impact is complete and you drop back down to regular tax brackets.
And it's just so important for people to understand that whole area of premiums and taxes and that kind of thing. I'll give you one quick example that happened to me. Was I looked at my marginal adjusted gross income, and I was just a few dollars over one of the brackets for Medicare Part B. By putting money into an IRA, my own money, I'm going to get it back. It brought my income a few bucks down below that particular number, and I didn't get kicked with a full year of Medicare Part B premium. So that's the kind of stuff that you want to learn and know more about in dealing with retirement income. It's not just taxes, it's not just investments. Okay, so I want to thank you, gentlemen. What a great job. Fantastic. This is what I was hoping would happen. And I can't wait to have a discussion with Ed Slott next month about some of the follow-up on it. We did hit the top of the hour. So I very much want to, again, thank you, Joe. Thank you, Jim. You did a great job. We will follow up.
Thank you.
Get back to the audience with some of the information. We'll try to post. Oh, they were asking about your articles and other things. We'll try to get some of that organized for you.
Thank you so much for hosting us and bringing us into this forum. Really enjoyed it.
I hope everybody has a healthy next month before we talk to you next. And again, thanks. Have a good day.